They said afterwards that the Duchess of Dunmore smiled when she saw them together. Not a brittle performance of composure held in place by sheer determination. A real smile, the quiet, unhurried smile of a woman who has just watched the final piece of a long-assembled puzzle settle into its place, and found the picture exactly what she had always known it would be. That was what unsettled people most. Not the scandal itself, though God knows the scandal was breathtaking. Not the mistress in the ivory gown standing at the foot of the grand staircase of Dunmore House, her gloved hand resting in the Duke's arm on the very night 300 of London's finest had gathered to celebrate 5 years of his marriage. It was the smile. Women in Genevieve Marlowe's position were supposed to shatter. The ton had arrived with that expectation quietly packed alongside their dancing slippers, because London society had always preferred its humiliated duchesses weeping and its scandals simple. Genevieve did not weep. She stood at the top of that staircase in a gown the precise colour of midnight, her late mother's sapphires at her throat and 5 years of careful, patient, entirely private knowledge in her dark eyes, and she smiled. Then she descended. What happened in the hours that followed would be recounted in drawing rooms from Mayfair to Edinburgh for the better part of a decade. But to understand that night, you must first understand the 5 years that built it. Genevieve Marlowe did not enter her marriage to James Weston, Duke of Dunmore, with illusions. She entered it with open eyes, a composed heart, and a memory sharp enough to hold everything she observed without writing a word of it down. Her father, Lord Marlowe, had been a merchant baron, self-made, formidably intelligent, and possessed of the particular clarity that comes from having built something real, with your own hands. He had given Genevieve 2 things above all others: an education that most men of the peerage would have envied, and a marriage settlement drawn up with the meticulous care of a man who loved his daughter more than he trusted any institution designed by men for men. The Dunmore dukedom had come to Lord Marlowe before James had come to Genevieve. The estate was ancient, distinguished, land-rich, and, behind its magnificent facade, financially hollowed out by 2 generations of careless stewardship. The Marlowe fortune would save it. James Weston, to his credit, had never pretended otherwise. He had been honest about the arrangement in the way of a man who considers honesty a form of dignity, and Genevieve had respected him for it from the beginning. What she had not expected was that she would come to love him anyway, not immediately. James Weston was not a man who invited immediate love. He was contained in the way of houses that have stood for centuries, imposing from the outside, cool in the interior, with rooms he did not open and a fundamental reserve he wore so naturally that most people mistook it for indifference. He was not unkind. In the early months, he was attentive in the careful way of a man who has been told attentiveness is required and is doing his honest best to provide it. He remembered details she mentioned in passing. He consulted her opinions on estate matters with a genuine interest that surprised her. He was, in all practical respects, a better husband than the arrangement had promised. But there were smaller things that mattered more than the practical ones. The morning she had found him in the orangery at dawn, not doing anything purposeful, simply standing in the early light, looking out at the grounds with an expression so unguarded it had stopped her in the doorway, and when he had heard her step and turned, he had not retreated into composure immediately. He had let her see it for 1 full moment. A morning 2 winters into the marriage, when she had fallen asleep over a book in the smaller sitting room and woken to find a blanket placed carefully over her, tucked with a gentleness that no one had witnessed and no one had asked of him. She had loved him for the blanket more than for almost anything else. It was a private kindness. The kind a man performs only when he is not performing at all. But private kindness, she had learned slowly and at considerable cost, does not survive sustained public indifference. And James was very, very accomplished at public indifference. Ladies Dorothea Vane arrived in their social world 20 months before the anniversary ball, and Genevieve had understood her within a fortnight. Not because Genevieve was suspicious by nature, but because she had spent 2 years learning to read rooms, and every room Lady Vane entered told the same story. She was the daughter of Viscount Carrington, whose fortune had been quietly destroyed by a combination of catastrophic investment and a son whose gambling habits had made him untouchable in the better clubs. The Carrington name was distinguished and the Carrington circumstances were desperate. Lady Vane was 26, recently emerged from a brief and conveniently childless first marriage to a minor baronet who had died leaving almost nothing, and she moved through society with the focused energy of a woman who has assessed the landscape and identified precisely where to place her next step. She chose James with what Genevieve could only privately acknowledge was excellent judgment. He was powerful, wealthy, and, crucially, a man whose wife's quiet competence had made him so comfortable that he had stopped noticing the comfort entirely. Lady Vane offered him something Genevieve had never thought to offer, because she had not believed it ought to be necessary. She offered him obvious, uncomplicated, completely unchallenging admiration. She laughed at everything he said. She deferred to every opinion. She looked at him as though he were the most remarkable man she had encountered in her considerable experience, which was, Genevieve reflected, a remarkable performance given that James was intelligent enough to know better. He was not, apparently, immune enough to resist it. There was a man who saw all of this clearly and said so. His name was Philip Greystone, and he had been James's closest friend since their school days at Eton. Two young men from neighbouring counties who had recognised in each other a fundamental seriousness of character that the frivolity around them never quite managed to erode. Where James was angular reserve, Philip was steady warmth, the kind of man who asked how you were and waited for the actual answer. He had stood beside James at the wedding with a handshake for the groom and a brief, genuine remark to the bride that she had thought about more than she should have in the years that followed. He had looked at her directly and said, quite simply, "He is a fortunate man, I hope he understands that." She had thought it a pleasantry at the time. She had later understood it was not. Philip had watched Lady Vane's campaign with the expression of a man witnessing a slow disaster from a fixed distance. He had spoken to James plainly, in the way of a friendship old enough to bear plainness. He had said that Lady Vane was performing, that the Carrington family needed restoration and had identified James as the means of it, and that James was in the process of discarding something of genuine and irreplaceable worth for something that would last precisely as long as it was useful. James had received this assessment with the particular coldness of a proud man being told an accurate thing he is not prepared to hear. He had suggested, with a quiet precision that was more cutting than shouting would have been, that Philip's kept concern for Genevieve had perhaps always contained a personal dimension, and that this rendered his counsel somewhat compromised. Philip had left without another word. He did not raise it again, but he did not stop watching. Genevieve had discovered the full extent of it on a Wednesday morning in September, 14 months before the anniversary ball. She had not been searching. She had gone to James's study to return a book and found, partially visible beneath the edge of a blotter, a note written in a hand she did not recognize but understood immediately. She read it once. She replaced it exactly where it lay. She went upstairs to her own sitting room, closed the door, and sat at her writing desk for a long time. She did not weep then either. She had thought she might, and was faintly surprised to find that what she felt instead was a settled, aching clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have been half-knowing something for months, and your mind finally agrees to know it fully. She took out a sheet of paper and wrote a careful letter to Mr. Gerald Holloway of Holloway and Sons Solicitors, Chancery Lane, who had served the Marlowe family interests for 30 years, and who possessed, above every other professional quality, a discretion so absolute it had become almost architectural. Her father had built something into the marriage settlement, a reversionary clause, nested in the document's fourth schedule in language so technical and precisely worded that the Dunmore family solicitors had apparently absorbed it, without fully comprehending its consequence. The clause permitted, under specific and documentable circumstances, the separation and return of the Marlowe fortune from the Dunmore estate. The circumstances required were the sustained, documented breach of the marital covenant's foundational conditions, conditions her father, who had trusted no one's good intentions indefinitely, had quietly enumerated. Mr. Holloway had confirmed, when she met him 3 days after sending that letter, that the circumstances had been established beyond any legal ambiguity for at least 6 months. The documentation was a matter of careful compilation. He was, he said, entirely at her service. That had been 14 months ago. Genevieve had told him to proceed carefully, completely, and without any communication that could be intercepted or observed. She had gone home and managed the household and attended the social engagements and smiled at the right moments and said nothing to anyone, except once on a grey November afternoon when Philip Greystone had called upon her under the guise of returning a volume of history he had borrowed from the Dunmore Library, and they had sat over tea for 2 hours, and she had found herself grateful for the company of a person who saw her without requiring anything of her in return. She had not told him about Mr. Holloway, but she thought, from the way he looked at her sometimes, that he understood more than she said. The anniversary ball had been James's idea. 5 years of marriage celebrated on the grandest possible scale. 300 guests, hothouse flowers, the finest champagne available, Dunmore House dressed in candlelight and white roses. He had organized it with the full weight of his considerable authority, which told her something he could not have intended. He was capable of focused, purposeful effort. He had simply been directing it elsewhere for 2 years. She had agreed to every arrangement. She had approved the flowers and confirmed the orchestra and overseen the supper menu with her usual quiet efficiency. She had also, 4 days before the ball, met with Mr. Holloway for the final time, reviewed the completed documents, and signed every page with her own hand. What she carried in the hidden pocket of her midnight gown, as she stood at the top of that staircase and watched her husband arrive with Lady Dorothea Vane on his arm, was a folded set of legal papers representing 14 months of patient, methodical, entirely private work. She had brought them not as a weapon. Genevieve had not been built for the performance of revenge. She had brought them because she had made a decision, and she was not the kind of woman who made decisions and then hovered uncertainly at the threshold. But the evening did not proceed as she had arranged it in her own mind. She descended the staircase with the composure that had always been her most reliable instrument, and she greeted her husband and the woman beside him with a graciousness so complete and so unperformative that Lady Vane, who had prepared for tears or ice, found herself entirely without a script. The orchestra resumed. The champagne circulated. 300 people exhaled slightly and began recalibrating their expectations for the evening's entertainment. And Genevieve did something she had not done in years at one of these events. She was simply entirely present. She talked to people she genuinely liked. She danced once with elderly Lord Cavendish, who had known her father and who held her hand with the warm steadiness of someone who had watched her grow up and thought well of the result. She laughed without calculating how it appeared. She moved through the room like a woman who has put down a weight she has carried so long she had forgotten it was not simply part of her body. James watched her. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in weather, not located, precisely but impossible to ignore. He was watching her with an attention she had not felt directed at her in a very long time. Real attention, the kind that costs something. She was aware, with a detachment that surprised her, that he had not sought out Lady Vane in over an hour. It was Philip who reached her first, materializing quietly at her side during a lull between dances with 2 glasses of champagne and the expression of a man who has been worried for 14 months and is attempting not to show it too plainly. "You are extraordinary, you know," he said, and it was so simply and genuinely said that she had to look away for a moment. "I am managing," she replied. "You are doing considerably more than that," he paused. "Are you all right, truthfully?" She looked at him then, this man who had been honest with her husband when honesty cost him the friendship, who had shown up at her door in November with a borrowed book and stayed 2 hours and never once made her feel observed or pitied. "I will be," she said, and meant it. James appeared at her other side 20 minutes later. He did not bring a prepared speech. She could see immediately that he hadn't, and that absence of preparation was itself a form of honesty she had not expected from him tonight. He looked at Philip with an expression she could not entirely read, and Philip met it steadily, without apology, and excused himself with a quietness that was not retreat, but simply decency. "I need to speak with you," James said quietly. "Please." The small anteroom off the main gallery was lit by a single lamp and smelled of old wood and beeswax. The music became a distant, muffled thing. James closed the door and stood for a moment with his back to her. Then he turned, and she saw something she had not seen on his face in 2 years. He looked stripped. The immovable authority that was so natural to him it seemed like a physical feature had shifted, and underneath it was something undefended and considerably more human. "I have been a fool," he said, not as preamble, as a full accounting. She waited. "Lady Vane is nothing to me. Whatever I permitted, and I did permit it, I will not pretend otherwise. It was never what it appeared. I told myself I was doing nothing wrong because nothing conclusive had occurred. I understand now that the telling myself was the wrong." He looked at her directly, and it cost him something visible. "I have been absent from this marriage in every way that matters while being present, in all the ways that are easy. I let a woman flatter me because I had confused your steadiness for indifference and told myself you did not require my attention. I was wrong, I knew I was wrong, and I continued anyway, which is considerably worse." The room was very quiet. "You wanted proof that the marriage was real to me," Genevieve said carefully. And you went looking for it in entirely the wrong direction. His jaw tightened. Yes, I have papers, she said. She withdrew them from her pocket and set them on the small table beside her, and she watched understanding move across his face. Not outrage, she noted. He did not look outraged. He looked like a man receiving the precise consequence of choices made over a long period of time, none of which he could argue with. My father built a reversionary clause into the settlement. Mr. Holloway has been preparing the documentation for 14 months. I signed it 4 days ago. It has not yet been delivered. James looked at the papers, then at her. Why not? It was the right question. She had not expected him to ask the right question. Because I am not a woman who acts from a ballroom, she said. And because I have not yet decided whether this is the end of something, or the beginning of a reckoning that might become something else entirely. Those are different things, James, and they require different actions. And I will not confuse them simply because the hour and the setting suggest I should be dramatic. Something moved through his expression that she could not name. It was not relief. It was more complicated and more serious than relief. It was the expression of a man who is understanding, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, the precise quality of the person standing in front of him, what she was, what he had been careless with. Is there anything, he asked, and his voice was careful now, that I could offer you tonight that would be worth offering? Not tonight, she said. Tonight I am going to walk back into my anniversary ball and be present in it, because I organized it, and it is mine as much as it is yours, and I refuse to surrender it. Tomorrow we will speak with Mr. Holloway together, and we will have an honest conversation, not a managed one, an honest one, about what this marriage is, and whether either of us believes it can become what it should have been from the beginning. She picked up the papers and replaced them in her pocket. What happens between tonight and that conversation is not something I can decide for you. She left him there. She walked back into the light and the music, and the 300 people who had been watching the evening with the barely concealed intensity of those who sense they are witnessing something they will describe for years. She found Philip near the edge of the room. She stood beside him for a moment, and he did not say anything, which was exactly right. At 5 minutes before midnight, Genevieve collected her wrap. She did not make a speech. She did not make a scene. She simply walked toward the entrance of Dunmore House with a composure so complete and so unperformed that it commanded the room's attention without demanding it. Behind her, one by one, and then in a quiet, steady stream, came the guests who had spent 5 years watching this woman be exceptional. Lord and Lady Cavendish, the Countess of Broughton and her husband, Philip Greystone, who paused at the door long enough to look back at James with an expression that contained no victory whatsoever, only the steady regard of a man who had been right and taken no pleasure in it. 14 people left, then 7 more, not in performance of solidarity. In the simple, private acknowledgement of people who recognize quality and had watched it be undervalued for long. Enough. James stood at the foot of his own staircase and watched them go. He watched his wife walk out of Dunmore House, and he felt the full architecture of what he had built, and what he had neglected settle on him at once, the way the heaviest realizations always arrive, not with noise, with a terrible, clarifying silence. Lady Vane had slipped out a side entrance at 11:30. Her departure went almost unnoticed, which was itself a verdict. By the following fortnight she had retreated to her family's estate in Shropshire, and by spring her brother Lord Carrington, whose restored social standing had been entirely the product of James's months of unwitting endorsement, found certain doors beginning quietly to close again. What the Vane family had borrowed, they had borrowed on terms they had not read carefully enough. The meeting with Mr. Holloway took place on a Thursday morning, as Genevieve had said it would. It lasted 3 hours. James listened more than he spoke, which was not natural to him and which she noticed and which mattered. The papers were not delivered. They were held in suspension, which Mr. Holloway noted in his ledger, with the careful neutrality of a man who has served one family for 30 years, and intends to serve them well regardless of outcome. What followed was not easy and was not fast. James Weston was a proud man, undertaking the project of becoming a less foolish one, which is some of the most difficult work a proud man can do. There were weeks that were better and weeks that were worse. There were conversations that required both of them to remain in the room past the point of comfort. There were mornings when Genevieve sat at her writing desk and held the fact of the unsigned papers like a door she was choosing, each day not to walk through, not because it was locked but because she was deciding, each day, that what was on this side of it was worth more than what lay beyond. The blanket had not been nothing. That was what she returned to on the difficult mornings. The private kindness of a man who performs it for no audience. That man was still in there, under the pride and the years of carelessness, and the cowardice that had dressed itself as restraint. She had seen him in the anteroom on the night of the ball, stripped of his armor and asking the right question. She was not naive enough to believe that a single honest moment rebuilt a marriage, but she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that it had been real. Philip Greystone called on them both 3 months after the ball, formally this time with an appointment and a proper visit. James received him in the study where their friendship had fractured and shook his hand, and said without preamble and without managing the words that he had been wrong and that he was sorry and that he understood if the ground between them needed time. Philip had looked at him for a moment and then said that 30 years was a long time to maintain a friendship, and he had no intention of discarding it provided James had genuinely taken the point. James had. Genevieve believed that. She had come to believe, with a careful honesty she brought to everything, that the man she had watched stand stripped and accountable in that small lamplit room was not performing contrition. He was experiencing it, and experience, she had always known, was the only education that actually changed anything. The papers in Mr. Holloway's office remained undelivered. They stayed there for many years, and Genevieve never regretted their existence. Her father had built them into the settlement, not because he expected her to use them, but because he had wanted her to know that she could, that she was never staying because she had no door. She was staying because she had examined the door, understood it completely, and chosen the room. That distinction, in the end, was everything. They said afterwards, and people said a great deal, because London always did, that the Duchess of Dunmore had walked out of her own anniversary ball and taken half the nobility with her. They said it was the most magnificent exit anyone had witnessed in a generation. They said the Duke had stood at the foot of his staircase with the expression of a man who had looked up from a game he believed he was winning and found the board entirely changed. They were right about all of it. What they could never quite capture, in all the drawing room retellings, was what had happened in a small anteroom off the main gallery between a man who had finally run out of armor and a woman who had never needed any. The specific weight of what was said there, and the specific courage it required to say it, and the longer, harder, more genuine courage it required to act on it in the months that came after. Some things happen where the chandeliers are blazing and 300 people are holding their breath, and those are the things that get remembered and retold. But the things that matter, the things that actually change people, that build something lasting out of something nearly lost, those things always happen in the quiet rooms. If this story stayed with you, if you held your breath somewhere in the middle of it, please subscribe. There are more stories coming, each one built around women who were underestimated, and men who learned, sometimes too late and sometimes just in time, the precise cost of that mistake. Share this with someone who loves a story that earns its ending, and tell me in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? I read every single one.